Okay, thank you to everybody for joining. Let me check my microphone. Yeah, we are continuing our shiur on Aleinu L'Shabeach. Last time we spoke about the early origins of Aleinu L'Shabeach and how the prayer was conjectured by some to be as early as the Beit HaMikdash, and that the prayers that were said amongst certain gathering groups, the Mamadot in the Beit HaMikdash, might have been the origins. Those prayer groups that went up to Yerushalayim a couple of times a year would have been the originators of this prayer. We studied how perhaps the prayer originated in the texts of the Hechalot literature, that perhaps it was early Tanoic texts which originated Aleinu L'Shabeach. Another theory we saw that was that perhaps Aleinu originated in the Shivot of Rav, in the Tefillah for Rosh Hashanah. Some hold that it went from the Tefillah from Rosh Hashanah into the Hechalot. Some hold that it went from the Hechalot into the Tefillot of Rosh Hashanah. And as I mentioned, some hold that's even older than that. And even some hold that it might be a bit later than the Shivot of Rav. So we discussed a little bit about the language and the style and the meter of Aleinu L'Shabeach last time. Tonight, I want to continue discussing how not particularly the ancient origins of Aleinu, but how Aleinu made its way through the Middle Ages almost until modern times. And I wish I would have had more time to prepare or more time tonight, but there's so much to study with Aleinu. And tonight, what I want to focus on is mostly the Middle Ages, and if we have some time for the modern era as well. Now, as we mentioned, Aleinu L'Shabeach in its style is quite old. Yet it has that meter, that four beat meter, Aleinu, L'Shabeach, Ladon, Hakol, Latet, Kidula, Leosevri, Shit. And yet that um that meter, this tefillah does not become a part of our main it does not become a part of our main tefillah. We don't see it as a part of our main tefillah until almost the 11th or 12th century. So today everyone thinks of Aleinu as the thing you say at the end of davening. But how did that become true? How did that become the case? So our first evidence for um seeing Aleinu, how it was understood in medieval times, comes from a teshuvah from Rav Hai Gaon. Not from Rav Hai Gaon, I should say from the Geonim. The Geonim have this teshuvah in Otzer HaGeonim, I think it's page 69 in Rosh Hashanah. There's a teshuvah from the Geonim where they are asked about saying Musaf and Rosh Hashanah biyachid. If a person's alone, he doesn't have a minyan, what does he do when he says the Musaf Rosh Hashanah Amidah? Does he do the 7 brachot? Does he do the quote unquote 9 with Malchiot, Zechonot, and Shofrot? How exactly does he do the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah biyachid? And does he say Aleinu or not? From the question and answer there, it is clear that the Geonim saw Aleinu as potentially poetic and as the sort of thing that only the Shliach Tzibur should do. Now, the responders are Rabbeinu Moshe Gaon and Rabbeinu Cohen Tzedek Gaon. Now, these are fairly early Geonim. It sounds from their words like they understood Aleinu to be a poetic embellishment for Rosh Hashanah. We never find in the Sidurim of Amram Gaon or the Sidur of Sadia Gaon or any of the Gaonic era texts, we never find that people were using Aleinu anywhere outside of the Chazan on Rosh Hashanah. The Chazan, the Shliach Tzibor on Rosh Hashanah would say Aleinu, and he would say Valken. But nobody else would ever say Aleinu. That's as far as we could tell from the time of the Geonim. However, the minhag of saying Aleinu is sometimes attributed to Rav Hai Gaon. There's an infamous tshuva from Rav Hai Gaon where Rav Hai Gaon is asked about the history of Aleinu and how it's supposed to be said. And Rav Hai Gaon responds with a, a Kabbalistic style response to the question. I wonder if I could pull it up quickly enough just to give you an idea of the language here. Give me 1 second. because it's actually worth hearing. The problem with this famous tshuva is that in it, Rav Hai Gaon talks. He speaks very highly of Aleinu, and he says, as we'll see later, Yeshua ben Nun wrote it, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai canonized it and made it a part of the davening. And then he goes on to a long Kabbalistic thing about how important the Aleinu is al Pia Kabbalah. Let me see. The problem is with this teshuvah is that he responds by speaking about Tchila Yeshajiv ki tshuvat Rabbeinu Gershom lemala mitchuvat Rabbi Alfasi, meaning I concur more with Rabbeinu Gershom than Rabbeinu Alfasi. And when Yeshua did it, he did it in order to Yeshua wrote it in order to be Mekadesh the Aretz and to sanctify Eretz Yisrael and to say that we should get rid of all the idol worship in Eretz Yisrael. The theme of Aleinu contains speech about removing the idol worship from Eretz Yisrael. The problem with this, and I'll just share my screen for a second from Elliot Wolfson's what's the word? Transcription of this. The problem with this is that Rav Hai Gaon never heard of the Rif. There's no way that Rav Hai Gaon ever heard of him. The Rif was 20 years old when Rav Hai Gaon passed away, and Rav Hai Gaon passed away at around 90 years old. For Rav Hai Gaon to have heard of Rabbeinu Gershom, or to have heard of the Rif, or to have ever corresponded with people who were in their circle is preposterous. And this teshuvah was considered by most scholars, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox, was completely considered to be either a tremendous mistake or a tremendous forgery. This teshuvah is not given a lot of historical weight. It is possible that certain portions of the teshuvah are authentic. It's possible that whoever forged it was dealing with pre-existing material, but it is not given much respect in the world of Teshuvot HaGeonim. Now, Elliot Wolfson actually believes that this is a forgery from Rabbi Moshe de Leon himself. That Rabbi Moshe de Leon was the writer of the Zohar, was the same person who forged this entire teshuvah. It's possible. It's not complete. It's not. What's the word? It's not a closed case, but we don't know who forged this, and it doesn't really give us any historical value. We can't say that Rav Hai Gaon, wrote. So that Rav Hai Gaon was aware of a minhag to say Aleinu every day. That's just simply not possible. So I just thought, in case you find that teshuvah, it's in Sharei Teshuvah. In case you find this teshuvah or a longer corrupted version of it, you should know that this is highly, highly questionable. Okay, now how does Aleinu L'Shabeach become the, what is going on here? Am I sharing my screen? That's hilarious. There is no share. Okay, good. So how is it that Aleinu L'Shabeach becomes the prayer that we all say after tefillah? Now, if you look in most of the Sidurim, Aleinu L'Shabeach is not part of davening. After Baal Tzion, the Chazan says a Kaddish, and the instruction of the early Sidurim and the early halachas farm is, and then the Chazan sits down, and then people do whatever they want. They can do the Ma'amadot, to the Marachot, whatever you want, Seder Maracha, whatever you want to call it. Some people do Pitum HaKtoret, Shir Shalyom, and Kelokenu, all sorts of different minhagim. But halachically speaking, that was when the Chazan sat down and tefillah was done. So how did Aleinu become a part and parcel of the end of it? So in the original version of Machzor Vitry from France, it doesn't say anything about Aleinu. But in a 12th century addition to it, it does say that every person says Aleinu Tiz on his own over there. And the Rokeach, who also lived in the late 12th century, says the same thing, that every individual should say Aleinu over there. We also find the same thing in Siddur Rashi, which is roughly from the same era. The Kolbo in Ted Zayin, and not in Orchot Chaim, unfortunately, and Sefer Machkim, they all bring a minhag to say it after every tefillah, while the Sor HaChaim, which is the Talmid of the Rashba, says that the French would only say it by Shachrit and Arvit, but not by Mincha. Why not by Mincha? Because Mincha doesn't have Kriyat Shema. And Aleinu L'Shabeach talks about the Yichud Hashem, how Hashem is only one. So you should only say Aleinu by Tefillah, which speaks about Hashem's oneness. Now, what's striking about the evolution of this minhag is that it only occurs in Christian lands. We only find Aleinu beginning to be said in lands which are Christian, and the minhag takes off from like wildfire. Especially the evidence from our manuscript Machzorim and Sidurim, like I showed last week from Corpus Christi. A lot of them tell us that this minhag spread all over, from Ashkenaz to France to Provence. We find all of the Jews living under the Christian kingdoms, and England, also England, of course. All of those lands, the Jews began to say Aleinu L'Shabeach, but the Sfaradim do not. The Sfaradim, if you look at Abu Darham, Rambam, Seder of Amram, none of the or any of the early Sfaradi poskim, none of them mention saying Aleinu L'Shabeach at the end of davening. It is only in the Sidurim and Sifrei Halacha of the Ashkenazim and the French that we find such a minhag. Now, the question is why? And as we conjectured last week, there's been quite a few conjectures, but one of the ideas set forward was that it was just one part of a whole series of things to say at the end of Tefillah. And it was the one that stuck. Like you had the whole Seder HaMaracha, and Aleinu just stuck. Others have, brought forward or suggested that Aleinu is more tied to the oppression and persecution by Christians of the Jews, and that's why Aleinu became a popular part of the tefillah in the morning, because the Jews of the Christian lands suffered greatly from the Christians, and they saw in Aleinu a message which was anti-Christian. And there's this there's just at least a hint to it in the Arugat HaBosem, which is a sefer from Rabbi Israel, one of the Balei HaTosafot. He says, Shamati shekach yesh litpalel lahevel barik. A person should pray that they should say the words in Aleinu that we bow lahevel barik ki b'gematria Yeshu Muhammad. Lahevel and hevel barik has the same numerical value as Yeshu and Muhammad. Alma kol shemamin b'shneim hem mishtachvim lahevel barik. We see that anybody who bows to gods such as Yeshu and Muhammad are bowing down to nothing. Very interesting thing that he so-called heard. And honestly, if you do the gematria, only Yeshu equals up to Varik, but Muhammad does not. If you do Mem Chet Mem Dalid, then that adds up to Lakel Lo Yoshia. That does add up. But essentially, they're, even whether or not that's true, okay, it's very unlikely it's true. Like this gematria of Yeshu being Barik or Yikaro is very unlikely true, because the tefillah predates Christian oppression. It's very unlikely that this tefillah was written at a time where Christian, or even in a place where the Christians presented an existential threat towards the Jewish people. We did bring up the idea that it might have been an anti-binitarian prayer. Like it might have been against people who were binitarian in belief, that they believed in a dual God structure. But to say that it's anti-Christian is a bit of a stretch, both based on the geography and on the era in which we believe Aleinu was written, especially if it's from the time of the Beis HaMikdash, or as we'll see from Yeshua ben Nun. So, where do we go from here? Let's discuss the first famous story of Aleinu in Europe, and that is the story of the martyrs of Blois in France. Blois, if you look today in France, you want to go on vacation to France. France is a beautiful place, and they have some beautiful villages and beautiful towns and cities. Yet, a lot of the magic that the tourist websites will tell you about is disguising centuries of sin, centuries of Christian persecution of Jews and murder that occurred in France, which the French people today would probably want to pretend never happened. Blois was one of those such cases. Blois is a really, really terrible pogrom, a very terrible story of the murder of over 30 Jews in this town. This town is close to Orleans. And what happened was that there was a count or whatever, a some sort of ruler of the area who was didn't had very testy relationships, a very testy relationship with the Jews. He particularly had a problem with one of the women in the town. Small town of Jews, like only 40 Jewish people were there. And at the time of the persecution, maybe only 30 something of them were in town. And he didn't like those Jews in his town because I think it seems like he might have been attracted there to a woman named Pulchalina, and she basically had him tied around her finger, and maybe he owed her money, all sorts of things. And he really didn't like the Jews of the town. One day, some servant boy comes running in that I was by the lake, and my horse got scared, and I was drinking, I was giving my horse to drink right next to a Jew. I think the reason my horse got scared is because the Jew must have thrown in a Christian boy into the river, and he killed him for his blood to bake matzah. Unbelievable tall tale. So immediately the count says, yes, what an opportunity. He throws all the Jews in prison. But he realizes that he has no evidence. He has nothing to pin on them. But right away, the priest shows up, and the priest says, yeah, I mean, keep them in jail. This, you don't need evidence. Well, we're going to take the guy who was accused, and we're going to do a waterboarding test. Let's see if he sinks or if he floats. And if he floats, then he's kosher. If he sinks, then he's guilty. I don't remember what happened with the whole floating test, but at the end of the day, they decided to round them up to burn them and to threaten them. Hey, you could convert to Christianity, or we're going to kill you all. They rounded them all up, and to make a long story short, they locked them inside a house and they set it ablaze. They tied them into a house, they set it on fire, and they murdered all 32 people there. We know this from Rabbeinu Baruch ben David HaKohen. He was a Jew who was sent to Blois to try to negotiate for ransom, to ransom the Jews out, but unfortunately it didn't. If you have if it didn't work out. If you have the book by Mark Jacobs, Jew in Medieval Times, you can read if you have Sefer Zechronot from Rav Ephraim Ibon, you can find the story in its entirety. The part of this story that's important for us is that when the Jews burned to their deaths, they chose a song to sing, which is a chilling and beautiful um, act of faith that really there's a beauty to it that can barely be spoken. But they chose in their dying breaths to sing together, and they sang Aleinu l'shabeach. And the goyim were very impressed by the melody. They thought it was a really beautiful melody, and the legend has it that they saw their souls fly upwards, etc. As Jewish legends go. Um, Choosing Aleinu l'shabeach is a really interesting choice. First of all, it means that to them, the Jewish people of Blois, it means that to them, this prayer was an anti-Christian prayer. It was a prayer that said how lucky we are to be Jewish people and not Christians and not Muslims. And what it also tells us is that this prayer to them was familiar to all of them, that they knew it by heart. It's not something that they just said on Rosh Hashanah. It's something they knew by heart and they knew the song to. This is what they chose to die to. The end of that story is that Rabbeinu Tam, the Rabbanim of France, found out about this. They got political first. They made sure to get this Count Theobald, I think his name was. They called him Theobald the Good, as if. They got him in trouble, real trouble, because of course that's murder, that's genocide. And then they made Chav Sivan, which is the day this happened, into a fast day, which was observed for hundreds of years. The Jews of France and Germany observed Chav Sivan as a fast day to commemorate these martyrs who died al Kiddush Hashem. And this shocked the Jewish community throughout the Rhineland. And it recalibrated everybody's brains to who they were living next to and what their Christian neighbors were like and how they were going to view their Christian neighbors. Even if there were Christian neighbors who were friendly to them, it just became so difficult to believe that they were safe. How could we be safe when an entire town of Christians saw no problem but to let their count go ahead and burn 31 people, and to allow them to burn to their death without any due process? So this is but one of the experiences, one of the very traumatic experiences that the Jews experienced in under Christian rule. And Aleinu, the factoring of Aleinu as part of the story tells us a lot about how Aleinu was viewed by them. Even if Yikaro or Varik has no allusion to Yeshu, they definitely understood it. We know of a minhag going back hundreds of years that Jews would spit by Varik. And you can imagine whether or not Varik really is or really was a composition that had anything to do with Yeshu. They understood it as such. And to them, Aleinu was almost an anthem for the Jewish people being proud of who they were rather than being Christian. Let's go a little bit further. 1 second. This leads me to the next point, which is understanding it as having been written by Yehoshua. Yehoshua, to say that Yehoshua wrote Aleinu is almost like saying that, I don't know, that David HaMelech wrote Yigdal, or to say that Yehuda Halevi wrote a Shlachrak song. To say that Yoshua ben Nun wrote Aleinu L'Shabeach is so outlandish that it's very difficult to accept as any form of Misorah. You need to understand that the meter, the language, the Lashon HaKodesh that Yoshua ben Nun was speaking is different than the Lashon HaKodesh spoken in Aleinu L'Shabeach. The meter in Aleinu L'Shabeach is clearly from 1,000 years after Yeshua ben Nun was nifter. And furthermore, the language of Hakadosh Baruch Hu didn't exist until the time of the Amoraim. We're not even sure that the Tanaim spoke with the words Hakadosh Baruch Hu. It's more likely that the Tanaim used the words Hamakom Baruch Hu rather than Hakadosh Baruch Hu. It is almost impossible to believe that Aleinu was written by Yeshua ben Nun. This is brought by, I think it's the Sefer HaMachkim for the first time, or the Kolbo. He mentions, Shamati, I heard that Yeshua ben Nun wrote it. It's very possible that the reason they were saying this was to counter the Christian claim that this was written against Yeshu. Because if it was written by Yeshua ben Nun, there's no way that it could be written in order to bash Christianity. So it's very likely that this we heard was basically an apologetic. And furthermore, when you look at the history of this Shemua that we heard, you fast forward 100 years and it becomes listed as fact. Like a rumor turns into fact. And this just unfortunately how literary history works. It's just something that is an outlandish rumor suddenly turns into, fact. Halacha l'maishim Sinai. You go to Wikipedia, they'll tell you Yeshua ben Nun wrote Aleinu L'Shabeach. I mean, not everyone on Wikipedia, but some people will tell you that. Now, there's another version of this anti-Christian text I wanted to read to you. You see, Aleinu L'Shabeach, as we have it today, has a pretty concise meter, but in the versions that were said in the 12th and 13th century, they would sometimes interrupt it. And this is to give you an idea of how anti-Christian it was and how much they must have suffered under Christianity to write a version of Aleinu like this. It would say, Shehem mishtachavim lehevel v'rik. And I'm sorry, I'm reading it from my paper because I didn't want to show it on screen. And for those who understand Hebrew, you'll understand what this means. Shehem mishtachavim lehevel v'rik. Adam, Efer, Dam, Mara, Basar Busha, Sirucha Rima, Timeim v'timeot, Mina'afim u'mina'afot, Meitim be'avonam, Unemekim be'pisham, Bluye afar rekuvei Rima v'toleya. Essentially, the dirtiest words they could find in Lashon HaKodesh, right? They say that the other nations bow to the lowest of the low. Even they bow down to mankind, so to speak. And there's clearly a bitterness to this interpolation on Aleinu, but clearly there were Jews who would add this to their Aleinu, and it's because the persecutions of Jews in Christian lands was severe and many times unbearable. And the persecutions, especially that the Jews in France, before they were expelled, endured, especially during the Black Plague, are unspeakable. There were Jews who were massacred during the Black Plague. And, to leave out the First and Second Crusade, the Jews of France and Germany had a very hard time under the onus of Christianity. One more thing I'll show you here is the Practica Inquisitionis Heretice, I think. This is from the French Dominican monk whose name was Bernard Gui, I believe. He had a handbook for inquisitors, and he writes in it that the Jews intend to. He's the first person, the first Christian from like the 1300s to be aware of Aleinu l'Shabach, and he writes like this: the Jews intend to curse the Christians, although they do not expressly name Christians, but in their circumlocutions that they employ, the Christian people is expressly intended and comprehended. Bernard Gui was a convert from Judaism, and he knew that the Goyim mentioned in that Aleinu l'Shabach in Jewish consciousness was an anti-Christian prayer, even though Aleinu l'Shabach in its essence and in its history was not an anti-Christian prayer. The Jews of Christian lands, but not the Jews of Muslim lands, definitely associated it with an anti-Christian message, and this essentially led to a lot of censorship in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. You'll find many sidurim which have areas crossed out, and I would like to share with you my screen. For example, can I find this quickly enough? Just as an example, of course, nothing ever works when you need it to, right? Sorry for anybody listening. It's going to take me an extra second here. I'm trying to open Google Chrome, but why would it listen to me when I need it to? Okay. Yeah, here in the British Library, we have, you know what? My tab closed on me, so if we're very lucky, I'll find it fast enough. Here we go. Okay. Share my screen. Share my screen. This is Kativ, the National Library of Israel. There are pages in many Sidurim from Ashkenaz which see it crossed out. The inquisitors, like Bernard, their job was to inspect books. Now, this kind of only happened on chance, right? It was their job to. I'm sorry, this is never going to load in time. But trust me when I say that you'll see a manuscript with crossed out Hebrew words. Essentially, their job was to inspect books when they were up for inspection and to cross out or to confiscate books that had objectionable things. So Aleinu l'Shabach would very often be crossed out with black ink or be cut out by the censor. Now, once the Protestant Reformation begins, you have much more censorship of books because the church was trying to combat any books that were objectionable to Catholicism or to mainstream Christianity, and that's when the Jews really got in trouble, and they really had to start leaving out the part of Shemesh Tachavim Lehevel Varik and Aleinu. Some of the Sidurim would put a little star there to say, this is where we say Shemesh Tachavim Lehevel Varik. Some of them would just not put anything. Some of them will put a space. Unfortunately, because that was the case in the printed Sidurim, many people grew up without knowing to say Shemesh Tachavim Lehevel Varik. And all the way until the early versions of Art Scroll, Yitzchak Yair, you find many Sidurim that don't have Shemesh Tachavim Lehevel Varik. The most recent versions of Art Scroll realized that was a huge mistake and put it back in. And they put back because they realized that it was just taken out because of the censors. The Sephardi versions, however, always had it. And if you look, how did the Sephardim begin saying Aleinu? It's because of the Torah. The Torah and his father, Rabbeinu Yaakov bar Asher and Rabbeinu Asher, came from Ashkenaz to Spain. And the Torah just says matter-of-factly in Kuf Lamed Gimel, V'omar Aleinu l'Shabeach k'shiyagia el k'kol manam yafsik ma'at kodem shemar v'anu korim mishtachavim. Right? He's clearly saying that a person should say Aleinu l'Shabeach at the end of davening, and this was just obvious to him. The Jews eventually, after the 13th, 14th century, after the works of the Torah became much more widespread, many Jews in Spain began to say Aleinu l'Shabeach at the end of davening, but not at the end of every davening. There are people who only said it at the end of Shachrit, people who said it at the end of Shachrit and Arvit. Some people said it at the end of all three. It was the Arizal who instructed people to say it at the end of all three prayers because of the Sodot inside the Tefillah of Aleinu. But it was not originally the minhag everywhere for people to say it by all three prayers. Even in the Ashkenazi lands, very often people would daven Mincha and Ma'ariv together. And if you're davening Mincha and Ma'ariv together, they would skip Aleinu after Mincha and they'll go straight into Aleinu, which makes a lot of sense. Here in New York, we have many shuls where people will walk out after mincha and they'll go daven Aleinu later. Therefore, people say Aleinu after mincha as well. But even in the time that the Mishnah Berurah mentions this, I mean, many places in Europe they would only say Aleinu 2 times a year. There are other incidents I didn't really get to. For example, in 1703, there was a Jewish convert named Francis Wenzel who also laid a series of charges to the king of Prussia. And because of him, the king of Prussia made an edict that Aleinu had to be taken out of Sidurim and it couldn't be said in shul, and they had to put guards at shul. It was a very big deal. We don't have any evidence of it ever being enforced, but the Shliach Tzibor in Prussia wasn't, at least in 1 or 2 shuls, wasn't able to say Aleinu Shabeach out loud because of this Francis Wenzel. Most of the most serious problems that the Jewish people encounter are because Jews will go south. When a Jewish person, begins to hate his own people, it's setting us up for trouble. And they snitch and they say things that are much worse than they actually sound. They say all the worst parts about Judaism and they tell them to the Christians. Now, was some of this true? Probably. Yes, it was true that the Jewish people didn't like the Christians. Is it their fault? Well, probably not. Now, we of course we have to, maintain accountability for the fact that us as a Jewish people did have prayers which we associated with or we you know considered anti-Christian. We do have to accept that we used to interpret some of our prayers to be anti-Christian. There's no way to get around that. And is that necessarily something that we have to feel guilt about? Well, depends who you ask. Some Jews will say absolutely not. Some Jews will say yes. Everybody has their own way of interpreting how a Jewish prayer can and should evolve. There was a conference that occurred for Jewish and Christian relations, and they asked Ruth Langer, who's an expert on tefillah and specifically Christian Jewish prayers, to speak. And I think this happened when the previous pope, asked. They were going to the church was going to renew saying a certain prayer, which prayed for Jews to continue being Christians, to become Christians. And a lot of Catholics like, wait, what? We're going to start praying that all other people should become Christians, even the Jews. Like, why should we add a prayer like that? So there was some Jewish pushback, there was some Christian pushback, and they decided to have a conference and say, listen, how could we just show accountability on both sides? How could the Jews come to the table and the Christians come to the table, and we could just talk to each other and talk about our past and see like how we could amend and fix our prayers to be more respectful and to be more peace loving. And so Ruth Langer has written a lot on, you know, Jewish prayers that were anti-Christian, and they invited her to speak because she is, the world expert on this. Her argument was, and frankly, I think she's correct, that you cannot expect the Jewish people today to change their prayers for Christian people. You're not walking into Borough Park and saying, listen, guys, there's a guy named the Pope. He lives in Vatican City. It's in Italy. And the Pope said that he would like if you guys stop saying Aleinu or Laminim V'lam Alshinim, right? You can't. That's not going to happen. Orthodox Jewry and the vast majority of people who daven according to the prayers of the Orthodox Jews are never going to change their prayers. We're so stubborn as a people. This is how we survive. We just do our minhag. We follow our halacha. Nobody's changing. The Jewish people are not changing their prayers because of Christian concerns. That's really not going to happen. The more productive route when it comes to liturgy is to reinterpret. And this is simply how religion works, and this is how sacred texts work. We negotiate with the texts that we inherited, whether they're biblical texts, whether they are rabbinical texts, whether they are liturgical texts. Religious people are constantly in negotiation with the text that they have received. And we have to expect the maturity for people to reinterpret these texts for the times. In modern times, we don't have problems with our Christian neighbors. The Christian neighbors in America, in contrast, especially the evangelical movement, are extremely pro-Israel. They give more money is given to the Zionist movement than to Jews in Israel by non-Jews than Jews, right? APAC today and the non-Jewish evangelical movement is extremely pro-Jewish and extremely pro-Israel. So we don't really have the same anti-Christian problems, and it's much more productive to expect the Jewish people to interpret their prayers better and to not intentionally interpret them as being anti-Christian or anti-Muslim. So we do learn some interesting academic things here in liturgy, where we see how, first of all, some prayers have can become more widespread and can catch more popularity because of their theological or anti-theological message, and it could be constrained to geography. And we also see how the interpretation of prayers can have a wide-ranging and a both and a devastating effect, honestly, on the trajectory of the tefillah, how it's used, and how it is received. So thank you, everybody, for your time and for your attention. If there's anything I left out, please ask me. I know there's a lot to cover in Aleinu itself. I think I did mention last week that I wanted to look into Valkena Kavalacha. I did look into it. It seems to be part of the original composition. Um, is there anything else I wanted to mention? Maybe I wanted to mention Moshav Yikaro, Moshav Kiso. Some people have changed the Girsah from Moshav Yikarot, which is again the same gematria as Varik and Yeshu. They changed it to a Moshav Kiso. And there's a couple of different textual variations among the different rites, but for the most part, it's the same. So with that, I think we have finished Filat Shachrit. Bezrat Hashem, next week, if we continue next week, we will continue with a discussion of minhagim around mincha. So thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you next week.